Okay, so while people are still joining in, I will do a few introduction slides and then we'll head over to Jay. Welcome. So it's our last March edition of user group. So recording, as always, will be later on available on our YouTube channel, so Power Platform User Group Stuttgart. Join there, subscribe, and you will get notified whenever something is on. So usually it takes me, I don't know, 3 to 5 days to do the recording and upload it there. Also, you can see on Meetup, LinkedIn, and Twitter channels what is happening, what are the news. Again, I will be with you today. As I said last time, Christian took a bit off from user group as he just got his first child last week. So he'll be off, and we are still trying to connect you with the best speakers, and I think we are the only user group globally which are doing it weekly. So a lot of work finding speakers and filling up the schedule for you. But as I already mentioned, a bit different things. So I'm doing Data Jazz on Tuesdays together with Nicola, so every second Tuesday of month. First two episodes we have Phil Seamark and Chris Webb, and 2 weeks from now Will Thompson is joining us, so it's a bit different format, more of a getting to know the person rather than technical talks. So you see all those people online, but you have a possibility here to ask them a lot of different questions. Also, what's coming up on user group is next week is Johnny Winter with us. Then Matthias Tiberbach before Easter, and I have a wrong date on Mara Pereira, just after Easter, so last week of April, Mara is with us about Power BI performance. So a lot of things coming in, lots of sessions, stay tuned. And today with us, Jay. Jay, welcome. Nice to have you here.
Thank you.
And stage is yours. You can take it over.
Great. Let me just start by sharing my screen. And while that's loading, can I please also join the Data Jazz at some point? I would love to just learn more about the community and get to know people a little bit better.
Sure. So let's be in touch over that.
Cool. Let me know if you can see my screen.
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thanks. Thanks for having me. Thanks for making the time. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being part of the community for Power BI as well. Today, we're going to talk about best practices for composite models on Power BI datasets and Azure analysis services. But just, before we get started, a little bit about me. You might go like, hey, wait, I know that guy. I've seen him before, which it could be. If you ever watched the blog where we do our monthly release, you'll see my ugly mug on that blog every month. So that's where you might know me from. I'm a Power BI program manager. So I worked with Microsoft for almost 15 years now. I joined the team in April 2020, the Power BI team. I live here in the US, and I'm one of the people responsible for the future and decisions and features on our product. I focus on modeling and DAX specifically. So anything related to, for example, composite models or the modeling view or the DAX query language, like, the calculation language that we have, all the things that we do there, like adding functions or changing things around with like the DAX editor. Those things are all my responsibility in my area. I do a lot of engine work as well, because of course, all of that calculations have to work in the engine that handles all the data as well. So you can find me here. These are my contact vectors. If you want to reach out, feel free. Send me a note on Twitter or LinkedIn, or send me an email directly. I'm always happy to learn from you and discuss and, basically learn from the whole community. So please feel free to do that. If, of course, I won't share anything that I cannot share publicly. That's also a reminder to myself, right? I cannot know if anybody watching this is under NDA. So I won't be sharing any non-disclosure information here, of course, in this session. But if you are under NDA, I'm happy to chat further at some point. So let's get started. Today the agenda is let's first level set ourselves, introduce the composite models on Power BI Datasets, explain a little bit about that feature and what's happening and how that came to be. I will also do a quick demo on it, and then we'll talk about some definitions that will help us frame the rest of the discussion for best practices and special considerations for this feature. So with that, let's get going. So composite models on Power BI Datasets and Azure Analysis Services. If you're new to this area, you might think, wait, but composite models, that's something that we already had, right? Power BI, for years now, has been able to allow you to connect to multiple data sources and combine data from source A and source B together and create more value, right? That's kind of like one of the central, most valuable value props of Power BI is if you connect to a data source, you don't have to just stick with that data source. You can just say, hey, I'm going to take something from my database that IT provided, and I'm going to take something from the web, and I'm going to take something from my Excel sheet. And there is some relation between these sources, so I'm going to combine them in Power BI. I'm going to add a calculation that I couldn't do because, for example, some data was missing from the corporate database or from the Excel sheet or from the web that I want to mash it up. For example, I have sales per country. I want to calculate how much sales we made per capita, which is not something that normal corporate databases track. Well, the web does. So you can bring in that data from how many people live in each country, and then you can add a calculation to say how many dollars or euros did we sell per person living in that country, which is a mashup of two data sources. That's what we call a composite, because composite means it's combined of more than one thing. So you might sit here and go like, there's nothing new, right? Well, you would be right. Power BI has done this for years. However, before we had this new feature in preview, if you connected to a Power BI dataset or to an Azure Analysis Services source, you would have noticed that you wouldn't be able to connect to create a composite. The moment you connect to any of those data sources, you cannot add more data. So you cannot do this mashup, right? You cannot go, oh, my Power BI dataset is here. Let me just get this data from this website and mash it up. Like what I just explained with other sources. You couldn't do that. And that's why we have this now in preview since December 2020 already. So it has been a little bit that we have this in public preview where you can now actually do this. You can now connect to a Power BI dataset or an Azure Analysis Service environment and then still mesh it up with other data. So that's just basically the feature that we're talking about, the preview feature that is still in preview. We're getting closer to making it general available, but as you can imagine, this is a pretty big feature and it has loads of impact across the world. So we have to make sure we get it right. So that's basically the feature that we're talking about, and I'll be sharing some best practices on how to use it. So let's just do a quick demo of this feature, so we all know what we're talking about. So here's Power BI Desktop, and I already have some data loaded in here from an Excel sheet, and I will add some more data here. So I'll just go to connect to a Power BI dataset, and what I'll do is I'll just basically add in the Power BI dataset. Now, before I wasn't able to do this because either you connect to a Power BI dataset or you don't. You wouldn't be able to add more stuff to your dataset if you add, or you weren't able to either add more data to your dataset once you're connected to it, to your data model once you're connected to a dataset, or, whoops, why did it switch? Okay, it's back. Let me just, there we go. Sorry about that. And also the other way around, you weren't able to add a Power BI dataset to a source that already had data, right? To a model that already had data. So let me just find the dataset that I want to connect to, which is here, which is our, let's imagine this is our IT provided sales data. I have my Excel sheet already loaded. So what I'll do now is I'll create the connection. And as long as the security is okay and everything tests fine and internet will work, it will tell me a little bit about that data set. So here I can choose to either load everything from the data set if I wanted to, or I could pick specific tables from the data set. Notice if I have perspectives enabled in that data set, if there's, for example, in Azure and other services, you can have something like perspectives, you can have them in Power BI as well. If you have perspectives in there, you can also leverage a perspective to filter down the tables that you want to get, right? I won't use a perspective right now. I'll just say I want to get all except for sales order, right? And then you can also check this box or leave it unchecked, which basically would say, if anybody adds more tables to this data set in the future, do I want those tables to automatically be added to my model, or do I not want that? And do I want that, for example, to do manually later, right? So do I want something automatically, or do I want to keep more control over what is being added? Since this is a demo, I'll just leave it on, but just so you know that that's there. I'll just click confirm. And what Power BI is doing now, we're figuring out if this is like a security risk or potentially crossing boundaries. It will tell me, hey, you know, you're adding a second data source. So potentially, depending on how you're going to use this, some information about one of the other data sources might be exposed to the other. And this is important if you're bridging, for example, organizational boundaries, like internal or even sharing amongst organizations. You have to know that if I have a relation, if I'll build a relation between these two sources afterwards, any filters have to flow from A to B. So let's say here's customer data, here's sales data that doesn't have customer data. If I create a relationship between those, customer names will be sent as a query filter to the source. So anybody capturing queries on the source will get the names and personal information about that customer in the query log, which is just something you have to be aware of. It's probably okay, but just so you know, especially where you're crossing organizational boundaries, this would be very important to consider. For now, I'll just go, yes, I'll create the model. Now what Power BI is doing, it is creating a local model. And why are we creating a local model? Well, we need some place to store the connections that you have made, and also any customizations that you'll make on this data set will also have to store, and I'll show you that in a second. So here, let's just go look at what we currently have. So I'll just go look at the model view. I'll just move these painters out of the way a little bit. And then, you know, you see now we have two what we call source groups. Source groups I identified by a color. So this is one source group, which are all the tables from my data set. And then the import things that I have from my Excel sheet are a different source group. So all of the things that you import will be one source group, and then per source that you load will be another source group, right? So you can see that with the icon, that's slightly different. This is DirectQuery, direct connection to Power BI dataset. This is an import, so this data is loaded into Power BI itself. Are we done? No, I can add more, right? This button to add more data is still enabled. So I can go in and say, you know what? I want to test and add some more. I want to test, let's say, oops, I'm picking the wrong button here. I want to add some more. I want to do another Excel sheet. Why not? I'll just add another Excel sheet. And I'll just go, you know what? I have targets somewhere here. I'm just going to add that as well. So now I have two Excel sheets. After this next screen finishes, I'll have two Excel sheets and one DirectQuery connection to Power BI, right? So I can just load this up. And then once that's loaded, I can add a relationship between these two, right? So I can go relate these things together. I can, I'll also relate the reseller group in just a second, because that's already there. So I can relate that as well, but just showing you that you can mash up the data set with multiple different sources. So targets, I'll move them over here for a little bit. I'll move reseller groups over here. Let me zoom in a little bit again, so you can see what's happening. Reseller has a relationship with reseller group, and reseller have a relationship. So I'm building a relationship now between an import source and my Power BI dataset, which is something that was impossible before. So I'm now just doing this, fine, and doing the same. And yes, this is bidirectional, and of course you should be careful with that, but for the demo, it's fine. Region and target, same thing. Let me just add that. Come on, add the relationship. Why are we not? Maybe something with the screen sharing might be. Why are we not dragging? That's interesting. Okay. Oh, this one works. That's crazy. Hey, let's see. Let me just add one real quick here manually then. So I want to go sales territory region to targets region, done, close. And of course, this will be a bidirectional again. For the demo is fine. Great. So I can do some formatting if I wanted. I could go into targets and say, you know what, this target number is actually going to be a decimal number. It's going to be a currency to be exact. Yep, there we go. And now what I can do is I can create a visual that says, okay, I've got sales amount per region. And so we're now just querying everything. We're still in the one data source, in one data set, right? Great, so I've got that. Let me turn that into a table. So now what I can do is I really wanted to add the targets as well, which is not something we had before in the data set. So I can add targets, and now I can see the target per region across the board, because with this relationship, we're now able to filter the targets to exactly the region. And of course, I can add measures as well. If I wanted to, I could do something like variance to target to say, hey, you know, I want to do calculate how far we are away or on target. Those measures will also be able to work because, hey, you know, they're just DAX and Power BI can just handle that. Of course, I'm not, you know, not going to type this, but I can do variance to target, add that in, bring that, and of course I didn't put it on the right table, it's on the customer, but for the demo it's okay. I can bring this in, and now we'll have a variance to target, right? So as you can see here, you can see the different ways that this might work, but basically it allows you to not only connect to more than one data set, right? It allows you to mash up data sets with other sources. It also allows you to do customizations and extensions. It allows you to add a measure. It allows you to change things about that data set, which wouldn't be reflected in the original data set. So with that, let's get back to the slides. So when we talk about this feature, the design goals that we have in mind is to allow you to extend a data set or an enterprise semantic model. When I say an enterprise semantic model, that's what I refer to as a Power BI data set or an Azure Analysis Services model, or enrich it. So extending meaning adding more sources, as I just did. Enriching means just add a measure, right? There's a measure missing or a calculation missing or some formatting is not right. For example, imagine that somebody in the US made the enterprise semantic model. For them, it's really logical to format any date as month, day, year. But if you're in Europe, it makes no sense to have month first. You want it the other way around. So you could then take that model and just make one simple formatting change, which would then be day, month, year for your users, which would make it way more useful and way more usable for your users. That would then be a very small enrichment, a small change that you can make. And then the other idea that we had is like allow you to create like an overview dashboard kind of idea where you have multiple data sets that don't have any relationship, but you just want to show visuals from each data set separately on one pane of glass. Non-goals were, we didn't design this for joining two or more sources by large shared dimensions. So imagine you have, you know, a huge customer list with millions and millions of customers. We didn't design this in such a way that we would allow you to join two big enterprise semantic models over that huge customer list in the middle. It's not, I mean, it might work, it might not work, but performance won't be the best. We didn't design that, but this feature with that in mind. So that's basically where we are. So I see there's a question. Let's see. Fernando. Yes, so on-premises, I don't know, Fernando, on-premises, which server are you using? Are you using SSAS on-premises? Because that won't be supported right now. It will be with the next version of SSAS. That's also the question from Xiao. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. The last question just came in. Can you use this? No. With composite models on analysis services on premises on SQL 2019? No. You will be after you upgrade to the next version of SQL, which is SQL 2022. You will have to have that because this involves engine changes. So we have to upgrade to that version once that's released, and then this will start working for on-premises sources as well. Can you combine two different Power BI data sets? Yes, absolutely. You can, that's also what I said, you can have multiple ones, but if they're really big and you have a big shared dimension, you might run into trouble a little bit with performance. Do you have in this example a duplicated table within the models? No, in this example, not. I picked a good example, but yes, there's naming issues, right? Table names and measure names need to be unique across your model. So if you have, for example, two data sources that both provide a date table, you will see that one gets the name date and the other gets the name date too. We're working on giving you more flexibility to choose before you connect or while you connect to specify what you want to have happen. So you could, for example, prefix it or suffix anything with a certain value, right? You could say dataset blah, right? Departmental date, for example. So that's something that we're working on. Some definitions that I will be talking about: cardinality, number of unique values in a column. Enterprise semantic model is a centrally managed Power BI dataset or Azure analysis services. A source group is what I said is anything loaded from a Power BI from one DirectQuery source, and all import and calculated table sources are also one part of one source group. Cross-source group relationship is a relationship as I just created. It spans two source groups. A remote model is anything that is the data source for the current local model. So for example, the Power BI dataset that I just connected to from my local Power BI environment, that will be the remote model. And then anything in that remote model is remote, like a remote table. Anything not in the remote model, for example, the ones that I imported into Power BI dataset, are considered local. And then we have wholesale versus non-wholesale. Wholesale queries are queries that only depend on objects in one source. So they don't span multiple sources. So if I just did sales amount for region, I will be in one source. That will be a wholesaleable query that gets executed. The moment I cross more than one source, for example, what I did with saying I want region, sales amount, and targets, which was a different source, that query that we need to run to make that visual on the screen, the table on the screen that I just showed you, will be a non-wholesaleable query. And that's important to understand the difference there. And the same for a measure. If the measure just relies on one source, it's a wholesaleable measure. Otherwise, it's non-wholesaleable. And that is something that you have to keep in mind because it has a pretty big impact at some point. So let's see, Fernando's asking, I had to give build permissions to users in the workspace for him to be able to see the report. Yes, you're right. That will change. Depending on what you use, it will change either very soon or a little bit later for you. But premium and premium per user, I'm excited to say within the next coming days, it will change. You will just have to give people view permissions to read a report as it should be. You still need build permissions to create a new data set as it should be. But if you just want to share somebody the report so they can consume it, they will only need view permissions for premium and premium per user workspaces. For pro workspaces, we'll have to wait a little bit longer for technical reasons, but also that is coming down the line. And that was one of the big roadblocks for us to declare GA for this feature because, honestly, it wasn't acceptable the way it is to go GA with that. Okay, best practices. If it isn't clear by now, avoid combining multiple enterprise semantic models. Just don't do this. Of course, you can, but it doesn't mean you should. This feature wasn't built for you to combine huge enterprise semantic models together. And huge is, of course, a subjective thing. We'll talk about it in the next slide a little bit. But keep in mind that this feature was originally built for you to say, I've got this big enterprise semantic models. It spans multi-million levels of data, multiple tables, great. This is one little thing that is missing. I want to add that on top, right? And that's basically what I tried to show here. Just do the thing that's on the right. Big circle, add one or more little circles around it. Don't try to combine multiple circles. If you have big circles, two big circles, it might still work, it might not, but you're on thin ice here. It was not built for you to mash up, combine two big circles together. However, it was built if you wanted to keep the two circles completely separate. So if you just wanted to get one pane of glass and have two big data sets, big enterprise semantic models separate, but on the same report, not related at all, no measures between them, no cross-source group relationship or cross-source group measures or non-wholesalable measures or relations, that's something that you definitely can do. But the moment you do this across source group kind of work with relations or measures, keep this in mind, please. 300 million rows on the fact table is not a huge model, but it all comes down to the cardinality of the relationship. And that's the next thing. Whenever you create a relationship across source groups, so between two sources, let's say your Power BI dataset and a SQL database, or a Power BI dataset and Excel, the key column, you have to specify a key column. Let's say that's customer ID or product ID. That key column should be ideally 50,000 rows or less, the cardinality. So the number of unique values in those key columns, keep them under this value. That's how I can guarantee you this will work performant. It will be fine. The moment you cross above this, you're on your own. I'm not saying it will break. It probably won't, but performance will be slower than you expect. And we will try to do better, but for now, this is the number that we put out. Joe, going back to your 300 million rows on the fact table, is that a huge model? It depends, right? The fact table itself is not huge, but if you had 300 million unique customers and you wanted to create a cross-source group relationship using that customer ID as one of the key columns, then yes, that would absolutely be huge, because that's way above the 50,000 that I just said. So the cardinality is 230 million. Sorry, but this is not the feature for you. This is not how this feature was built for now. Another thing, always in general with Power BI, but especially when you're using this feature, use a proper dimensional model. If I got $1 for every single time that I have to tell a customer after they open a support ticket that got escalated to me, that the only reason that this doesn't really work or the performance is bad is because the dimensional model isn't there or is wrong or is just non-existent, because they put everything in a flat table or in an OLTP schema, I was not working at Microsoft anymore. I would be rich by now. Please don't do this. Always use a star or snowflake. That's the only data model that actually works for Power BI. Power BI was built with that in mind. Don't try to wrestle anything else in there. You will be on your own. You will be on thin ice. The moment the data explodes a little bit and starts growing above a couple million, things will start breaking and become very slow, and you'll be scratching your head. Build a dimensional model, especially when using this feature. So I hope that makes sense. Now, once we start thinking about cross-source group relationships a little bit, please store dimensions that are unique to a source with the fact table, right? So imagine you have this, right? You have fact sales in one source group, so you loaded that from somewhere, and then you introduce a DIM customer and a DIM region in another source group. If they are only there in that source group and there's no reason for them to be there because they're just separate there, move those guys into the same source group, because that way you would get rid of one cross-source group, which is non-wholesalable relationship. So your queries would not be optimized if it's non-wholesalable. So the moment you move this dimension, if you can move this dimension into that source by saying DIM customer is now part of source group B, you would be able to get a wholesalable optimized query, and your performance will be way better because it's inside of the same source group. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes the source group that you're connecting to, the data set, has been operated by somebody else or managed by somebody else. You cannot just add this dimension, I know. But in general, keep in mind that you want to keep the dimensions as close to your fact as you can, ideally within the same source group. Just eliminating the number of cross-source group relationships. If you're doing calculated columns over large tables, keep them simple. Again, one of those, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And avoid doing a calculated column across source groups if you can. If you're using a group by, a filter, or an aggregate. So if you, for example, have a table A, which is a remote table, right? So it comes from a data set. And in your Power BI desktop environment, you created a calculated column on it. consider if that calculator column can maybe be moved into the source itself instead of you defining it into your local environment. And of course, sometimes it can't, but sometimes you might think like, you know, I've been doing this over and over and over again in multiple composite models. Maybe I should be moving this calculator column as a default extension into this source group to begin with, because then your performance will be way better, because there's nothing non-wholesaleable about this. This will be optimized and you get better performance. So if you can move those calculated columns to source groups to your source instead of doing it on the lower level. So to quote Matthew Roach a little bit, do it as far upstream as possible and as far downstream as necessary, right? So move your calculated column upstream if you can. Do that, especially if you use group bys or aggregates. Then when you're creating visuals, again, this comes back to wholesale versus non-wholesale. You'll get better performance if you limit the fields in a visual, in one single visual, to a single remote model, right? So columns on a visual should ideally be limited to just a single remote model. In my demo, I just did this. I just went away and went and showed you sales and targets side by side in the same visual. It's gonna be fine, but sometimes you might run into weird performance issues because of this. So if your use case doesn't really require you to do this, I would encourage you to split them out into separate visuals. For example, you could have product and sales in one visual, and then product and cost in the other visual, and then have a relationship between product, and then the performance of those two separate visuals would be better than having one big visual, because they can be executed by two sources at the same time. So you get better performance than waiting on doing this all at once. Also using, for example, a trick of linked slices, you could have one filter on product, one slicer on product, and that would then set the product in the blue source as well as in the yellow source at once. So you don't have to go, oh yeah, now let me set product A on source 1 and then same product on source 2, right? You could link them together, and then you could say, hey, you just selected the product in the blue source and it will also filter in the yellow source. And I could just show you that in two side-by-side visuals. But yes, you will be duplicating the product name into visuals. That's absolutely right. Great. So that's some of the best practices that we learned about in the last, what is it, almost 2 years now, 1.5 years with this feature. Rest assured, there will be a best practice document going out when we are going GA, and loads of the things that I already talked about will be in that document, if not more. So we'll publicly document these best practices and explain to you why you should care about them. So you don't have to refer to this recording, of course, you're welcome to, but things might change between here and when we go general available. Some special considerations for you. When using Excel with this feature, so when using Excel against one of these composite models that you created, keep in mind that Excel still generates MDX, which is not DAX. And those are less optimized than similar DAX queries. So in general, that's true. And this feature forms no exception. When you use Analyze in Excel, so you start querying using a pivot table against the Power BI dataset, which could be one of your composites you just created, you will be using MDX, which is in general less optimized than DAX. So results will be worse compared to doing it in Power BI itself. Some of the MDX query patterns that we generate are non-wholesaleable, so that means they won't be optimized, even though they refer to objects in one source group. And I just said at the beginning, if it's all in one source group, it will be optimized. That's true for Power BI. It's true for DAX. It's not necessarily true for MDX. It's not necessarily true for Excel. So if you do the Analyze in Excel, you use a slicer or a formula thing, the query pattern, the query that Excel will generate for you, the MDX query, is not necessarily as optimized as it could be. Just keep that in mind. But this is not, Fernando, I think you're referring to what I just said about best practices. That best practices are not publicly available yet. It is not there. There's the link from Michael helps, but it's not about all composite models. And the preview feature has its own page, which is the DirectQuery for Power BI Datasets and Azure Analysis Services docs page. So if you can look that up, Michael, as well, and put it in there, that would be great. But the best practices doc that I just referred to is still, we're still writing it. We're still learning every day as users use this. So we haven't publicly made that available yet, but it will be available before we go general available with this. So you'll be able to find those best practices and these considerations in our docs on this page and on maybe potentially another page if it becomes a long topic. Another one, when you work with measures that have been defined in a Power BI data set that you consumed, right? So remember, remote means it's a data set that is a source to my composite. Remember that all selected and all without parameters in remote measures do not work with calculated columns added to the composite model. So if you have a calculated column in your local model and you use an all selected or all without parameters against that measure, oh, my dog is joining me in the office. Hello. My office assistant is here. Thank you for putting in that link, Michael. If you combine that, it will not work properly. Also, there's performance issues that you might run into when it's non-wholesalable query with measures. Just be very careful. That's basically what I'm trying to say here. Be very careful. Be on the watch out for performance issues if you start doing anything with remote measures and using those in local models or referring to them, especially from calculated columns, but also from measures in your local version, local model. Please be mindful of that. Calculation groups, I'll just close the door. Because of course, dogs don't close the door behind them. Calculation groups, for now, all formatting will be lost if you use a calculation group and you switch from a local model to this composite model using a Power BI dataset. If you start combining to it, calculation groups will lose their format. That's a bug. We're working on it to fixing it. But that's just something that you need to be aware of. Afterwards, you can put the formatting back. So your numbers will have to be reformatted, etc. It's kind of annoying. We'll fix it. But it's more important to think about calculation groups in a remote model on measures in a composite. So basically, look at the bottom of the screen here. If I have a total sales measure that I define in my local composite model, and I also defined an internet sales measure in my local thing, and I do total sales is internet sales plus reseller sales, and reseller sales is a measure from the remote model, keep in mind that when this gets executed, calculation groups that might be defined in the remote model are not applied. So what this will mean, for example, let's say the calculation group has been set to calculate a year to date. Calculation group is in a remote model. Then reseller sales will be calculated as year to date. Because reseller sales is in a remote model, the calculation group in a remote model has been defined by your user in the slicer as year to date. Of course, reseller sales will then be calculated as year to date. Great. Internet sales, because it's not in a remote model, it's in your local model, won't have that same behavior. It will not take the calculation group from the remote model. It will not be applied. So what you will be doing here, if your remote is set to year to date for calc groups, total sales will now be the sum of whatever internet sales provides, and then the year to date for reseller sales, which is probably not the result you want, because that's really misleading, because you're now adding an actual with a year to date, which is weird to do. So just keep that in mind. If you're working with calculation groups, be very careful. I would even avoid using remote calculation groups. I would define local calculation group, or even avoid calculation groups altogether if you can when using this feature. Again, the formatting thing will be fixed, but for now, a calculation group or a measure is treated as a black box in the remote, so we don't know, the local model doesn't know what the calculation group has been set to. Okay, and another one that's important to note, oops, there's something wrong with the formatting here. Let me go fix that, because otherwise you cannot read the text. I'm sorry for that. Why is this not working the way we wanted it to? Let me just move over here. There we go, that's better. Right, so filters across source groups. So I showed you how you can create relationships across source groups, right? I showed you how I created a relationship between reseller and reseller groups, which was a cross source group, or region and target, right? Or sales territory and target on the region key. That's what I showed you. You can not have that relation filter two tables in the same source group. So look at the top right. If I have budget and sales in source group B and I have a calendar table in source group A, you can't have calendar related to both budget and sales. That's, by the way, something that we're looking at changing, but for now that cannot happen. So this will mean if you wanted to add just your own calendar table and just replace that, the current date table in the source group B with your own calendar table from another source group, let's say your Excel sheet, and just relate it to all the facts that you might have, that won't work. Of course, if you have only one fact, it's fine. But if you have multiple facts, that won't work. So either you need to duplicate your calendar tables, which is not really what you wanted to do. So basically, like standardized dimensions is kind of the market term for this. That is not available. And then the other one is a filter from a table inside of a source group cannot filter another table inside the same source group through a filter or through a table inside another source group, which sounds really weird. But basically, this is like how filters flow through the data model. You could have, you could end up in the situation where region, because of the relation, region is in source group D, has a relationship to filter customer in source group C. If then customer, because you selected region North America, so you only see the customers in source group C that are in North America, then afterwards filters through a relationship or through a calculation the sales table in source group D again. So you get this like back and forth, like V shape on the side, V shape between how filters flow, because you basically went out from source group D, put a filter, and then use that same filter to filter something back in source group D. That is not acceptable. It's not performed, and it's not supported. If you wanted to do this, you needed to bring source group customer from source group C into source group D, and then this would be fine because it would all be in one source group. So just keep in mind, the moment you start doing these kind of things, it becomes pretty interesting, really. So in this case, yes, you would have to bring a duplicated table. So that's basically all. And Marco Russo has a great video on from the beginning of this feature when it was just in preview about the things that you should be worried about. It is a little bit outdated because things have changed a little bit since then. But yes, in general, the advice that he gives is still there. You could absolutely filter sales directly from region if you can. In this case, you could, if you build that relationship, yes, that would be great. But if it has to go through customer because there's no other way, then this won't work. You have to bring in customer to source group D, right? And then it will still be in one source group and will be fine. But yes, the best result would be to relate region directly to sales. If you can, add that key to sales, to the sales fact, and create a relationship between region and sales immediately, then this will all work. You don't have to go through customer. You could definitely just do customer to sales, right, as well, but just don't do this like this V-shape move between the two. So that's all that I had in terms of best practices and special considerations. Just as a summary, and I have some links as well. This feature is really powerful. It almost feels like the sky is the limit and you can do whatever. It's almost true. There are some considerations, some specific challenges that you have to keep in mind, and I hope this was useful because I gave you an overview of the most common ones, or the ones that I'm aware of, that are tripping people up. So definitely keep in mind these kind of cross-source group relationships. The moment you create those, think about what this means, what the impact might be on performance, and especially if you start creating things with cal groups, keep in mind how that will work together. Set yourself up for success by following the best practice that I laid out at the beginning. Don't try to mash up multiple large data sets, use good cardinality key columns, use a star schema, other things. So please keep that in mind as well for the special considerations that we talked about. If you want to learn more, the links are already in the chat. I think both of them are not. The guidance one is not there, but the second one that I have is a slightly different one, which is more about the feature itself. Please, study these, look at them. The first one describes the current feature that we're talking about here. The second one is the general composite models feature. And when this goes GA, it will be rolled into that feature. So this first link will redirect you to the other page. To the second link, the best practices document will be included in that page or in the guidance doc, or we'll probably just refer to one of the two. So that's basically where you will be able to find more once you get closer to GA. So with that, that is all that I have for today. So feel free to come off mute, ask questions, jump in, give me your feedback. I already answered loads of questions while we went, but let me know if there's anything else.
Thank you, Jeroen.
You're welcome. No, nobody with questions, concerns, things you want to ask, like when is this going GA or something else?
When is it going GA?
Everybody is shy.
No, I cannot answer your question about when this goes GA because this is a public video. It will end up on YouTube, so I cannot give you that answer, unfortunately. So let's see. There's a question: when will we have SQL Server 2022? Also, cannot answer. Not because I don't want to, but I'm not on the team. I don't decide for SQL Server what their timelines for release are. So I have no idea. So I can give you a guess, but it won't be any useful. So I would ask that to the SQL Server team. How about the VertiPack engine in combination with DirectQuery? Is import also an option, but does it keep the scheme changes when then of the Power BI dataset? I'm not sure, Richard, what you're, by the way, fellow Dutchman, what you're referring to. Can you come off mute maybe and ask your question?
Yeah, sure, Jeroen. Well, if you use an import in a mixed model instead of DirectQuery, if there are changes to the Power BI dataset, will it come automatically to the import model, or should you then reapply the changes manually?
So this feature assumes your. Let me get that straight. You're saying you want to import the Power BI dataset into your model?
Yeah, because if you use DirectQuery, right, then you're not able to maybe add extra columns, right? You're restricted to only
That's
measures.
what this feature is all about.
But with DirectQuery, then it doesn't use the VertiPack engine, right?
Correct.
Or
Correct.
It doesn't, or it does?
It does not.
And
so
don't you miss extra performance then?
Yes and no. I mean, yes, VertiPack will be less performant, but this is basically the whole feature, is that we allowed you to now make a DirectQuery connection to a Power BI dataset. Before, it had to be a live connection.
Yeah.
You weren't able to do any customization. There wasn't any optimization either, by the way, because it was not VertiPack.
Right.
Well, it was maybe, but in some shape or form. But it wasn't the same as import. Then with this feature, you're now able to make a DirectQuery connection. So you now have two connection types. You either have live to a data set, or the moment you add in more data or you want to make customizations, you're switching to a DirectQuery connection. I would not advise you to do an import on a Power BI data set. That is really strange. That is importing an AS model into an AS model, which doesn't feel good. Don't do that. But using this DirectQuery feature, what you can do now is you can now connect to that data set, and then you can make your customization. You can add a calculator column. You can add a measure. You can make format changes as you want. They will still live in the local model, and then there will be a DirectQuery connection to your Power BI data set. So you get the best of both worlds, because the VertiPack engine will work on your local model, and then the data is still in the data set. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, helps for sure. Thank you.
Sure. Gopal has a question. You had mentioned about fixing the formatting issue with calc groups. Will this take care of the current issue? Yes. Gopal, yes. The answer to your question is, will this take care of that? Yes, that will. your second question, when we do composite models with datasets, it's a GQ2 dataset. Will this further reduce performance compared to an import model? Yes, absolutely. So in general, DirectQuery is going to be, well, it's not entirely true to say less performant than import, but it's up to the source to be responsible for the performance, right? So yes, of course, if I can load data into my import into Power BI Desktop, that will be the fastest ever. But since this is a DirectQuery connection to an AS source, to Power BI datasets, which are just AS and other sources, performance won't be horrible. It will be good. But yes, it will always be better to have import. However, as I just said when I answered Richard's question, if you import a Power BI dataset, which is already in an AS structure, in an analysis services structure, into Power BI Desktop, you're wrestling an analysis services structure into another analysis services structure, which really sounds very backward. That's not the way this was built, right? So I don't encourage you to do that. I don't think you can even do it. If you go to Power BI Desktop and go Power BI Dataset, I don't think there's a way for you to import that data into your local model, and you shouldn't be. Just leave it where it is. Make a live connection if you don't need to make any extensions or changes, or using this new feature, make a DirectQuery connection so you can get a local model, you can make those customizations. You shouldn't. Exactly. Thank you, Joe. Thanks for having me back here. And I don't think you can. With analysis services, you can, but with Power BI datasets, I don't think there's any option for you to create an import connection to a dataset.
I once did it with analysis services, and the result was really bad.
It's horrible.
Yeah,
because you're wrestling something that's already dimensionally model. You're flattening everything, and then you're making a dimensional model again, which is like, you already had something beautiful. You strip everything off, you make it flat, and then you add everything again. Why? Great. Anything else? Okay. Questions? I'm still here.
You use it while you can, so otherwise you need to wait for a new blog post from Jay.
Right, exactly. It doesn't have to be about this feature. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
So I have an interesting question for a product team. How are you picking Power BI ideas from a list?
Well, we actually did a webinar about that a little while ago. I think almost a year ago, on how we do that. But yeah, I mean, the list of Power BI questions or Power BI ideas is, I think last time I counted, 26,000 long, which is huge. So there's multiple things on how we approach this. One of the ways we look at it is we look at the top 25 by number of votes. Basically, what's the most popular thing? And every semester, right, we plan for every half year, we come up with plans of what we want to do. And the Power BI ideas is a huge input into that. And every semester we try to, from the top 25, pick at least a couple that we can do. The reason that sometimes it might feel like it's being slow is because the things that are in the top are there for a reason, because they are not easy to make, right? So the things that have been around forever are there because some of them are like very hard to do, and they might sound very simple, but they are very hard to do. Dark mode, great example. Very popular. Everybody wants dark mode. And it feels, if you look from your side, you go like, that's easy, right? You can just add a skin to Power BI Desktop and that's easy. You could probably do it in a week. No, absolutely not. We need to build all the foundational work to allow you to do templating, which will take forever. And then we'll have to go through all the accessibility things. We have to change so many things. This will take a long time before it's going to be there. It's just, so when you look at ideas, you might go like, oh, but this is very simple to make. The reason those things are not implemented yet is because they're not very simple to make. And then...
Additional question just to answer that. So why analysis services is always behind Power BI in features?
So why is that? It's simple. It's not. But I'm half joking. The engine of Azure Analysis Services is not behind on Power BI features. Actually, that engine is owned by the Power BI team and will always be just a little bit ahead of Power BI features, because we need to have the engine things first before we can show it to you in the UI on Power BI. So you will see new features coming up in the engine first, and you might go like, what's this? If you ever look at the engines itself or write your own queries, you go like, what's this? That's because we build it in the engine and then we bring it to Power BI. So that's the way we develop this. I think your question is about analysis services on premises versus Power BI and why that is always behind. And the reason for that is very simple. We release Power BI every week. Analysis services only gets a major release every 2 years on premises, maybe 3 years. We get a quarterly update, but certainly not every week. Imagine us pushing you, your IT department, an update every week. They would go crazy because they haven't been tested and everything. They have to do everything and roll it out and package it. They would go crazy. That's why this is so behind. And also, whenever we make an update to the on-premises engine, we think about, do we want to enable this on-premises? Do we think there's use for it? Do we have everything in place to do this? For example, the feature that we just talked about, right? It's great. We could have put that in the engine, but we also need to do some gateway work to make sure these two talk together. So us putting that in the engine right away, we could have done that. Without having the gateway would still not be any use to you because you wouldn't be able to use it. So we have to wait until the gateway is updated so it can handle it, and then we can make the engine change. So that's why you always see this engine rolling a little bit behind on Power BI. And then, of course, there's also the angle of business. We want to get you to Power BI. We want to get you to the Power BI service. That's our goal, right? On-premises is great, but our end play where we are more interested in is you being in Azure and on the Power BI service. Let's just be very, very frank about that. That's where we want to be. So there also sometimes might be business choices that we make to go like, nope, we won't ship this on premises just because if you want to use this feature, you're welcome, but you need to come to the cloud with us. Sometimes that happens. I'm not saying for this feature, by the way, but sometimes that happens.
Okay, so if you have any questions, feel free to unmute so we can have it as collaborative as possible. I just played the outro slide, so for the next week. So this session will be available in a few days whenever I manage to catch some time to do the editing on our YouTube channel. And next week you can join us with Johnny Winter for Power BI Dynamic Measures. So I think are there any more questions to issue? Power BI is a public link, and some companies don't want to expose data in such environment.
Well, it's not public, right? It's authenticated. Unless you publish to web, it's not public. You still need to sign in. I honestly don't know why that is a problem.
And it's still bring your own key feature.
So we cannot touch the data more than we can when you're on premises. We cannot do anything. It's not ours. We cannot control it. Your data is there. It doesn't matter if it's on premises or not. I know I'm oversimplifying things. I know there are situations where legally you're not allowed to do this in some countries, but it's not a public link. It is still authenticated. I would even argue if you go look at our data centers where we run Power BI in, that's more secure than most of the data centers that are used on premises. Does your data center of your company have an anti-tank ditch around it? I guess not. Guess what our data centers have? They have it. So don't come at me and say, oh, my data center is more secure. It's not. Your data center is not more secure than Microsoft's. No way. I'll eat my hat if it is. So this is basically just a moot argument. Of course, with legal, yes, it's a requirement. Sometimes you have to because of the laws. But if it's just about fear of security, that's complete bullcrap in this day and age.
Hi, Jeroen.
Yep.
Can I ask to continue with my earlier question?
Sure.
So I was asking about the formatting option because currently in calculation groups, when you put in dynamic format strings, you lose the format string in some visuals. For example, in a stacked column chart, you lose the total format string altogether. So I was asking whether this you are forthcoming correction will correct those also, or that will be
it should, yes, unless there are specific bugs in that visual, which might be.
It is a standard Microsoft visual, not custom visuals.
Yeah, but it might be that in that visual there's a bug. That might be. I don't know. But in general, you lose your dynamic format strings now. Yeah. That is something that we'll fix. So your model will have the right format string. Now, if that visual maybe doesn't honor that, I don't know. Might be that there's a small bug in there. Then, of course, it still won't work. But in general, today you lose your dynamic format strings. We'll bring that back. So from the model side, it should be fine. And then, of course, it's on the visual side to make sure they show it correctly. And if it's a custom visual, all bets are off, basically. With standard visuals, you would expect all of that to work. Yeah. But there might be a bug in that layer as well. I don't know.
Okay. The other one general, is the other one is on again on the DirectQuery to dataset. Yeah. I just want a clarification is like, say, for example, a DirectQuery to a SQL server, the performance depends on the SQL server. So it is relatively bad compared to an import model, like, what you say. So my question is, because a DirectQuery is to a dataset is already on Vertipack, will like the performance be like so bad as, say, for example, a SQL server DirectQuery, or the performance to a data set because it's already in a Vertipack storage? Will it be?
It will be way better than a normal. So what happens, I think if I understand your question correctly, you're basically trying to compare SQL Server, which is a relational engine, and doing a direct query to that versus doing a direct query to a already semantically modeled engine, which is a multidimensional engine, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. So for the pack, you can expect the difference in performance to be huge. As in, the direct query to relational source will always be, well, always is a strong statement, but in like 99.9% of the cases will be way worse than doing a direct query to the Vertipack engine. Because remember, when we do a direct query to a relational source, what we do in Power BI, we have to transform that relational source into some kind of dimensional model in memory right away, or in memory in the query pipeline when we're querying, to make sure that Power BI handles it, because Power BI requires a dimensional model. So we'll do all that while querying.
Okay.
When you are querying a direct query to a dimensional model like Vertipack, none of that has to happen because it's already in the right format.
Okay.
So that's why it will be way better performance.
Okay. Thank you.
It would be interesting to make a test, actually. If I have a Power BI model published, I query that and I create a composite out of that model and query that. So the differences in performance between those two.
Well, I mean, there will be a little bit performance because in one case you're going import, right? And the other you're going direct query. So yes, the performance between A and B will be worse off. But compare it to, if you make the comparison complete, you say, hey, I create a Power BI dataset, I add a report on it. That Power BI dataset has data imported from SQL. That's the first, that's type A. Then I make a direct query connection to that data model and query there. That's type B. Then I make a type C, which is a direct query directly to that SQL source. Compare those. I would say A would win, B would be second, and C would be third.
For sure.
Yeah, that's the way it should be. If you see anything else, let me know, because something is wrong. So yeah.
Okay, I think all the questions are up. People, nobody puts any more. So Jay, want to thank you a lot for joining us, for spending 1 hour with the users. And for everybody else, for everybody who joined, thank you for coming. I know people are coming from all around the world, so somewhere it's morning, somewhere it's late in the evening. Hope to see you next week with Johnny Winter, and week after that with Matthias. So a lot of great topics, and let's stay in touch, Jay, over Data Jazz on Tuesdays.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be joining again at some point. Let me know. I just want to say from my side, thank you. Thanks for organizing this. by the way, thanks for driving this community sessions and this user group. But thank you as well for being part of the user group and taking part in this and being part of such a great community. I don't know if it's being said to you often enough, but to be honest, the Power BI community is the reason we go to work every morning, right? You are the ones that we're building this for. And just having you being as happy with our product as we are, that you're willing to spend your free time on a Saturday or in the evening, or even in the night or early morning, to just sit here and listen, talk about this, that just means the world to us. So I want to say thank you as well for being part of the community and being such great users. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jay.
Thanks. Talk to you
See you
later.
next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.